The Southern California sun blazed overhead as Captain Sarah Chen finished her 6th mile around Camp Pendleton's perimeter track. Sweat soaked through her gray PT shirt, the fabric clinging to her shoulders as she slowed to a cool-down walk. She'd been on base for exactly 9 days, moving through the installation like a ghost, observing, taking mental notes, and compiling a detailed assessment that would eventually land on the commandant's desk. This wasn't her first evaluation assignment, but it was certainly her most important. At 11:45 hours, the lunch rush at the main mess hall would be reaching its peak. Sarah checked her watch and changed direction, heading toward the large warehouses-like building where hundreds of Marines would be crowding in for their midday meal. She'd deliberately chosen this time, this place. You learn more about a unit's true culture in informal settings than you ever could during formal inspections. The mess hall was where ranks sometimes blurred, where exhausted Marines let their guard down, where the real character of a command revealed itself. She entered through the side door, immediately hit by the overwhelming cacophony of voices, clattering trays, and the industrial hum of kitchen equipment. The smell of hot food mixed with sweat and the distinctive scent of military facilities, a combination of industrial cleaner and worn linoleum. The line stretched back from the serving area, at least 50 Marines waiting their turn, many still in camouflage utilities from morning training exercises. Sarah grabbed a tray and utensils, joining the line behind a group of younger enlisted Marines who were loudly debating the previous night's football game. She kept her expression neutral, her posture relaxed in her plain gray PT gear with no rank insignia visible. She looked like any other Marine grabbing a quick lunch after a workout. That was exactly the point. She'd learned long ago that people revealed their true nature when they thought no one important was watching. The line moved slowly. Sarah used the time to observe. To her left, a staff sergeant corrected a private first class on proper mess hall etiquette. A good sign. Near the beverage station, 2 corporals were helping a struggling young Marine carry his overloaded tray. Another positive indicator. But she also noticed smaller issues. Trash overflowing from bins that should have been emptied, a group of lance corporals cutting in line without anyone saying anything, and an overall sense of chaotic disorder that spoke to inadequate supervision. She had just reached the serving area, accepting a plate of chicken and rice from a galley worker, when it happened. Lance Corporal Derek Morrison burst through the entrance like a man on a mission. He was running late. His platoon sergeant had held them over after a particularly brutal combat conditioning exercise, and Morrison had exactly 15 minutes to eat before he needed to be at his next training block. His uniform was still damp with sweat. Dirt streaked across his sleeves from low crawling through the obstacle course. His stomach growled painfully. He'd skipped breakfast, and the protein bar he'd eaten at 6 o'clock was long gone. Morrison saw the long line and cursed it under his breath. He didn't have time for this. His eyes scanned for shortcuts, for any way to speed up the process. That's when he spotted someone in PT gear moving slowly near the serving area, apparently distracted or confused about which items to select. Without thinking, without really looking, Morrison made his move. He shifted his weight and drove forward with his shoulder, the way he'd been taught to break through enemy lines during close-quarters combat training. The impact was solid, forceful. Sarah felt the hit before she saw him. The collision sent her tray tilting dangerously, the plate of chicken sliding toward the edge. Her water cup toppled, splashing across the metal serving counter. She managed to save most of the tray through quick reflexes honed in far more dangerous situations than a mess hall lunch rush. "Move it!" Morrison's voice was sharp with irritation as he pushed past. "Some of us have places to be." He didn't look at her face, didn't register the athletic build that spoke of serious combat training, didn't notice the small scar above her left eyebrow from shrapnel in Helmand Province. Didn't see the way her eyes, dark brown and calculating, tracked his movement with the precision of someone who'd spent months identifying threats in hostile territory. Morrison grabbed a tray with one hand and pushed forward toward the serving line, muttering something about people who blocked traffic during rush hour. The reaction around Sarah was immediate and electric. 3 nearby Marines who'd been reaching for plates froze mid-motion. A corporal who'd been standing 2 people behind Sarah went visibly pale, his eyes widening in recognition. Staff Sergeant Marcus Jenkins, who was supervising the serving line, saw the entire exchange and felt his blood pressure spike. "Oh, hell," Jenkins whispered, loud enough for the Marines near him to hear. "That kid has no idea what he just did." But Sarah Chen didn't react the way they expected. She didn't call out, didn't demand the young Marine's attention, didn't pull rank or make a scene. Instead, she calmly steadied her tray, accepted napkins from a galley worker to wipe up the spilled water, and continued through the line as if nothing had happened. Her expression remained neutral, but her mind was already working. This wasn't just about one disrespectful Marine. This was a data point, a symptom of something larger.
Her 9 days on base, she'd seen other small failures in discipline. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that would appear in official reports, but a pattern nonetheless. Little erosions in standards that, if left unchecked, could become major problems downfield. She watched Morrison storm toward a table where several other Lance Corporals were already eating, their conversation loud and peppered with profanity that would have earned corrections in a more disciplined unit. He dropped into a seat without acknowledging the Marines around him, focused entirely on shoveling food into his mouth as quickly as possible. Sarah found a seat in the corner of the mess hall, positioning herself with her back to the wall, old habits from deployment. From this vantage point, she could observe the entire room. She ate slowly, methodically, her trained eye cataloging everything: the leadership styles of the NCOs present, the interactions between ranks, the overall morale and discipline of the junior enlisted Marines. Staff Sergeant Jenkins appeared at Morrison's table within minutes, but Sarah subtly shook her head when he glanced her direction. Not yet. Let this play out naturally. She wanted to see how the chain of command would respond without her direct intervention. As she finished her meal, Sarah pulled out a small notebook from her pocket, the old-fashioned kind, not a phone or tablet. She jotted down brief observations in shorthand only she could decipher. This incident would definitely make it into her report, but not in the way Morrison or anyone else might expect. She stood, bussed her tray, and walked toward the exit. Just before leaving, she paused and looked back one more time at the young Lance Corporal who'd shoved past her. He was laughing now, completely oblivious, surrounded by his friends. Sarah Chen smiled slightly. In her experience, the best teaching moments came from genuine mistakes, not manufactured scenarios. Morrison had just handed her a perfect case study in what happened when basic military discipline and courtesy broke down. What the young Marine didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that his careless moment would soon become a catalyst for change that would transform not just his own career, but the entire culture of the battalion preparing for deployment. She stepped out into the bright California sunshine, already formulating how she would handle this. The real question wasn't whether to address Morrison's behavior. The question was how to use this incident to fix the deeper problems she'd been documenting since her arrival. Behind her in the mess hall, word was already beginning to spread through whispered conversations and shocked glances. The reckoning was coming. Morrison just didn't know it yet. Captain Sarah Chen walked across the sun-bleached parking lot, her mind already 3 steps ahead of the moment. The heat radiating off the asphalt created shimmering waves in the distance, but she barely noticed. She'd endured far worse conditions in Afghanistan, where temperatures reached 120 degrees in full combat gear while coordinating intelligence operations that saved countless lives. What Lance Corporal Morrison couldn't possibly know, what nobody in that mess hall except a select few senior officers understood, was that Sarah Chen wasn't just another captain passing through Camp Pendleton on a routine assignment. Her official cover was simple. She was a captain in transition between assignments, temporarily attached to Camp Pendleton for administrative processing while awaiting her promotion board results. In reality, she had unrestricted access to observe every aspect of battalion operations, from formal training exercises to informal interactions in places like the mess hall. The credentials hidden in her service record told a story that would have shocked Morrison had he known. Sarah had enlisted at 18, working her way through the ranks before being selected for officer candidate school.
She deployed to Iraq twice as an intelligence sergeant, then returned to Afghanistan as a lieutenant leading tactical intelligence teams. Her second Afghanistan deployment, the one that earned her the Purple Heart, was still partially classified. The official record stated she'd been wounded during a vehicle ambush. What it didn't mention was that she'd stayed in the fight for 47 minutes after taking shrapnel to her shoulder and leg, directing air support and coordinating the evacuation of 3 critically wounded teammates while insurgents tried to overrun their position. The Bronze Star citations mentioned exceptional valor under fire, but couldn't detail the classified intelligence she'd protected or the high-value target network she'd helped dismantle. At 32 years old, Sarah had seen things that would break most people. She'd held dying Marines in her arms, made split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died, and carried the weight of leadership in situations where failure meant body bags and flag-draped coffins. That experience had taught her something fundamental. Discipline wasn't just about following rules for their own sake. Discipline was the foundation that kept Marines alive when everything went wrong. It was muscle memory that took over when conscious thought failed. It was the difference between a unit that fell apart under pressure and one that fought through hell and brought everyone home. As she reached her temporary office, a small, sparse room in the headquarters building, Sarah sat down at the government-issued desk and opened her laptop. The document she'd been compiling over the past 9 days was already 47 pages long. It detailed everything from major policy violations to subtle cultural indicators that most observers would miss. She added a new entry time-stamped 11:52 hours. Mess hall incident. Junior enlisted Marine physically contacted officer without recognition or courtesy. No immediate correction from nearby NCOs. Subject appeared rushed, stressed, and operating in survival mode rather than professional military bearing. Indicative of broader pattern. Standards enforcement inconsistent. Basic military courtesy eroded. Junior Marines not being held accountable for conduct. But Sarah didn't stop there. She added context. Subject's unit recently completed field exercise. Possible factors. Inadequate break between training events. Insufficient time allocated for personal maintenance. Leadership not managing Marines' time effectively. Recommend investigation into unit training schedule and NCO supervision during transition periods. This was Sarah's gift, the ability to see beyond individual incidents to systemic problems. Morrison's disrespect wasn't just about one young Marine having a bad day. It was a symptom of leadership failures at multiple levels. Her phone buzzed, a text from Sergeant Major Williams. "Ma'am, need to discuss the incident. Morrison has no idea. Half the battalion knows already. Waiting on your guidance." Sarah typed back, "Meet me at 1400. Conference room B. Bring battalion training schedule and Morrison's service record. Don't inform him yet." She set the phone down and opened another file. Morrison's personnel jacket that she'd pulled from the system. 22 years old, from a small town in Ohio, joined the Marines straight out of high school. Decent rifle scores, adequate physical fitness test results, no major disciplinary issues in his record. His performance evaluations were average, not exceptional, not terrible, just average. Sarah studied his service photo. Young face, earnest eyes, the expression of someone who genuinely wanted to serve but hadn't yet understood what that really meant. She'd seen thousands of Marines just like him over her career. Good kids with potential, waiting for someone to show them what right looked like. The question was, what had his leadership done to develop that potential? Or had they simply processed him through training pipelines, checked administrative boxes, and assumed he'd figure it out on his own? She pulled up the battalion's organizational chart. Morrison belonged to Weapons Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. His company commander was Captain Rodriguez, a prior enlisted officer with a solid reputation. His platoon commander was a 2nd lieutenant fresh from the basic school, young, inexperienced, still learning. His platoon sergeant was Staff Sergeant Chen, no relation, a combat veteran, but reportedly overwhelmed managing a platoon of 43 Marines while also serving as the company armorer. The picture was becoming clearer. Morrison wasn't a bad Marine. He was a product of a system stretched too thin, with junior leaders who didn't have the time or training to properly mentor their Marines, and senior leaders who were focused on meeting operational requirements without ensuring the foundation remained solid. Sarah had seen this pattern before in units that later fell apart under the pressure of deployment. Small cracks that seemed insignificant in garrison became catastrophic failures in combat. A Marine who didn't respect officers in the mess hall wouldn't suddenly develop that respect when mortars started falling. A unit that tolerated sloppiness in basic military courtesy would tolerate sloppiness in weapon maintenance, tactical discipline, and mission execution. She closed the files and stood, walking to the window that overlooked the parade deck. In the distance, she could see formations of Marines conducting drill practice, their movements sharp and synchronized. From here, everything looked perfect, but Sarah had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. Her promotion to major was scheduled to go through in 6 weeks. After that, she'd be reassigned to Marine Corps headquarters as a staff officer, helping shape policy and training standards across the entire force. This evaluation of Camp Pendleton's battalions was her final field assignment before moving into that strategic role. She intended to make it count. The mess hall incident would be her opening move, not to
destroy Morrison's career, but to use his mistake as a teaching moment that could transform the battalion's culture. She'd done similar things before in Afghanistan, turning tactical failures into lessons that saved lives on subsequent operations. But this required careful handling. Come down too hard, and Morrison would become a scapegoat with the real systemic problems remaining hidden. Too soft, and the lesson would be lost, the message diluted. She needed to thread the needle perfectly, hold Morrison accountable while also exposing the leadership failures that had created an environment where such incidents could occur. Sarah checked her watch. 2 hours until her meeting with Sergeant Major Williams, time enough to review the battalion's last 3 command climate surveys and training incident reports. She returned to her desk, fingers flying across the keyboard, pulling data and building her case. Somewhere on this base, Lance Corporal Morrison was probably finishing his next training block, completely unaware that his careless moment in the mess hall had set in motion events that would change not just his life, but the trajectory of an entire battalion preparing for war. The shadow had been cast. Soon, everyone would see what it revealed. The news traveled through Camp Pendleton's 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines with the speed and intensity of a wildfire in dry California brush. It started with Staff Sergeant Marcus Jenkins, who'd witnessed the entire mess hall incident from his position, supervising the serving line. The moment Captain Chen disappeared through the exit, Jenkins pulled out his phone. His first call went to Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell, the company gunnery sergeant for Weapons Company, Morrison's direct senior enlisted leader. "Gunny, we've got a problem," Jenkins said, his voice tight. "Morrison just physically shoved Captain Chen in the mess hall hard enough to nearly knock her tray out of her hands." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Morrison? As in Lance Corporal Derek Morrison? Our Morrison?" "That's a firm. And before you ask, yes, he had no idea who she was. She's in PT gear, no rank showing. The kid treated her like she was some boot getting in his way." Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell felt his stomach drop. He'd been a Marine for 16 years, long enough to know that this kind of incident could detonate like an IED, sending shrapnel in every direction. "Where's Morrison now?" "Should be heading to his vehicle maintenance class." "Gunny, there's more. Captain Chen isn't just some random officer. I heard from the S3 shop that she's here on special assignment, some kind of evaluation for the commandant." Mitchell closed his eyes. This was worse than he'd thought. "I'll find him. Don't let this spread any further until I can." But it was already too late. Corporal James Martinez had been standing 3 feet away when Morrison shoved Captain Chen. He'd recognized her immediately. He'd been part of a working party that had moved furniture into her temporary office the previous week, and Sergeant Major Williams had personally briefed them that Captain Chen was not to be disturbed and deserved maximum courtesy. Martinez had seen the medals and commendations displayed in her office, including photographs of her with generals and the commandant himself. The moment Morrison pushed past her, Martinez knew his fellow Marine had just made a career-ending mistake. Within 5 minutes of leaving the mess hall, Martinez had told his team leader. Within 10 minutes, his team leader had told their squad leader. Within 20 minutes, half of Weapons Company knew that Morrison had assaulted an officer, because that's what it would be called, regardless of whether Morrison knew her rank. By 12:30 hours, the story had reached Lieutenant Josh Brewer, Morrison's platoon commander. Brewer was only 23 years old, 6 months out of the basic school, and this was exactly the kind of situation his training hadn't fully prepared him for. He immediately sought out his platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant David Chen. "Staff Sergeant, I need you to find Morrison and bring him to the platoon office. Don't tell him why, just get him there quietly." Staff Sergeant Chen, a combat veteran with 2 Iraq deployments under his belt, read the lieutenant's expression and knew something serious had happened. "Aye, aye, sir. Can you give me a heads up on what we're dealing with?" Brewer explained what he'd heard. Staff Sergeant Chen's jaw tightened. "That kid," he muttered, shaking his head. "I've been trying to get him to slow down, think before he acts, show some military bearing, but we've been running in ragged with training schedules, and I haven't had time to really mentor him properly." It was an admission of failure, and both men knew it. Meanwhile, Sergeant Major Williams was already in motion. At 51 years old, with 23 years of service spanning multiple wars and countless deployments, Williams had seen nearly everything the Marine Corps could throw at him. But this situation required delicate handling. He found Captain Rodriguez, Morrison's company commander, in his office reviewing training schedules. "Sir, we need to talk. Now." Rodriguez looked up from his paperwork, immediately sensing the urgency. What happened? Williams closed the door and explained the mess hall incident in detail. He watched the color drain from Rodriguez's face as the implications became clear. "Captain Chen is the one conducting the commandant's evaluation?" Rodriguez asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The same Captain Chen who's supposedly determining whether this battalion is ready for deployment?" "That's a firm, sure. And one of your Marines just physically contacted her in a disrespectful manner in front of
dozens of witnesses." Rodriguez stood and walked to his window, his mind racing through the potential fallout. This wasn't just about Morrison facing non-judicial punishment or even a court-martial. This was about the entire battalion's reputation. If Captain Chen's report indicated serious discipline problems, it could affect their deployment schedule, their mission assignments, even their future manning and resources. "Where's Morrison now?" Rodriguez asked. "Staff Sergeant Chen is retrieving him. But, sir, there's something else you need to know." Williams pulled out his phone and showed Rodriguez a message he'd received from the battalion operations officer. "Captain Chen isn't pushing for immediate disciplinary action. She sent word through the S3 that she wants to meet with you and Lieutenant Colonel Reeves this afternoon at 1400. Rodriguez checked his watch. 90 minutes. What do you think she's planning? Williams had worked with enough smart officers to recognize a strategic mind at work. "If I had to guess, sir, she's not interested in just frying one lance corporal. She's looking at the bigger picture. Morrison's mistake is a symptom. She's going after the disease." By 1300 hours, the story had mutated as it spread through the battalion. Some versions had Morrison deliberately shoving Captain Chen and cursing at her. Others claimed he'd knocked her completely down. A few wild variations suggested he'd actually grabbed her or made inappropriate comments. Morrison himself remained blissfully unaware of the firestorm gathering around him. He sat in his vehicle maintenance class, struggling to stay awake as the instructor droned on about proper PMCS procedures for the M1161 Growler. His shoulders still ached from the morning's combat conditioning exercise, and his stomach was full from the hurried lunch. The incident in the mess hall had already faded from his mind, just another frustration in a long series of frustrations during a hectic training cycle. When Staff Sergeant Chen appeared in the platoon office and called his name, Morrison assumed it was just another tasking, another last-minute detail that would eat into his already limited personal time. "Lance Corporal Morrison, you need to come with me," Staff Sergeant Chen said, his tone neutral, but his eyes carrying a warning Morrison didn't catch. "What's this about, Staff Sergeant?" Morrison asked as he gathered his notebook and followed his platoon sergeant out of the classroom. "You'll find out soon enough. How was lunch today?" Morrison shrugged. "Fine, I guess.
Rushed. I was late getting there because Sergeant Phillips held us over, and then the line was moving slow. Had to push through to make it to this class on time. Staff Sergeant Chen stopped walking and turned to face Morrison. Push through? Explain what you mean by that. Just, got past some people who were blocking the way. No big deal. Staff Sergeant Chen closed his eyes briefly, a gesture Morrison would later recognize as a man preparing to deliver terrible news. Morrison, did you notice who you got past in that mess hall? Some Marine in PT gear. Wasn't paying attention, honestly. Why? Come with me, and when we get to the platoon office, you're going to want to keep your mouth shut and listen very carefully. The tone in Staff Sergeant Chen's voice finally penetrated Morrison's exhausted, distracted mind. His heart rate picked up. Staff Sergeant, what's going on? What's going on, Morrison, is that you just physically shoved a captain, a highly decorated captain who's currently evaluating this entire battalion on behalf of the Commandant of the Marine Corps. Staff Sergeant Chen resumed walking, his pace faster now, and in about 30 minutes, you're going to be standing in front of the battalion commander trying to explain why you thought assaulting an officer was acceptable behavior for a United States Marine. Morrison stopped walking entirely, his legs suddenly weak. What? No, that can't be right. It was just someone in PT gear. There was no rank. That's exactly the problem, Lance Corporal. You didn't look. You didn't show basic military courtesy. You didn't treat another human being, let alone a fellow Marine, with the respect they deserved. Staff Sergeant Chen's voice was hard now, the disappointment evident. I've been trying to teach you this for months, but we've all been so focused on combat training and technical skills that we let the fundamentals slide. Well, congratulations. You just showed us exactly what happens when we forget that everything matters. How we treat people, how we carry ourselves, how we represent this Corps every single moment of every single day. Morrison felt like he might vomit. His mind raced back to the mess hall, trying to remember details, but all he could recall was being frustrated, tired, and focused on getting food quickly. As they approached the platoon office, Morrison could see Lieutenant Brewer waiting, his young face showing a mix of concern and severity that Morrison had never seen before. The reckoning had arrived. Lance Corporal Derek Morrison had never been more terrified in his life. Not during the gas chamber at boot camp, not during his first live fire exercise, not even during the moment he'd signed his enlistment papers and committed 4 years of his life to the Marine Corps. This was a different kind of fear, the soul-crushing realization that he'd made a mistake so fundamental, so catastrophic, that it might define the rest of his military career. He sat in the platoon office for 45 minutes, each minute stretching into an eternity. Staff Sergeant Chen had positioned him on a chair facing the wall, standing at parade rest while the phone rang.
Constantly and hushed conversations happened behind him. Morrison caught fragments. Battalion commander wants him there. Captain Chen specifically requested, no, don't tell him anything else yet. At 13:55 hours, Sergeant Major Williams himself appeared in the doorway. Morrison had only seen the sergeant major from a distance during battalion formations. Up close, the man was even more imposing, 6 feet of coiled intensity, with eyes that had seen combat in 3 different countries and seemed to look straight through Morrison's skull into his inadequate soul. On your feet, Lance Corporal, Williams commanded. Morrison stood so fast he nearly lost his balance. Sergeant Major, you're coming with me. You will march at attention. You will not speak unless directly addressed. You will answer every question with complete honesty. Do you understand? Yes, Sergeant Major. The walk to the battalion headquarters building felt like a death march. Marines stopped what they were doing to watch Morrison pass, their expressions ranging from pity to curiosity to barely concealed satisfaction at seeing someone else in trouble. Word had clearly spread far beyond weapons company. They climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, turning down a corridor Morrison had never had reason to enter before. The offices here belonged to senior officers, majors, lieutenant colonels, the people who made decisions that affected hundreds of lives. Williams stopped in front of a conference room door, knocked twice, and entered without waiting for a response.
"Lance Corporal Morrison reporting as ordered, sir," Williams announced. Morrison followed him inside and felt his heart nearly stop. The room contained exactly 4 people. Lieutenant Colonel James Reeves, the battalion commander, sat at the head of a long wooden table, his expression unreadable. Captain Rodriguez stood to one side, looking deeply uncomfortable. Sergeant Major Williams took a position near the door, effectively blocking Morrison's only exit. And there, seated calmly at the table with a notepad in front of her, was the woman from the mess hall. She was wearing her digital camouflage uniform now, the captain's bars gleaming on her collar. Morrison's eyes were drawn involuntarily to her left breast pocket, where rows of ribbons told a story he was only beginning to understand. Bronze stars, Purple Heart, Combat Action Ribbon, Navy and Marine Corps Commencement Medal with Combat V device, on and on. He'd shoved a war hero. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "Sit down, Morrison," Captain Chen said, her voice calm and even. Not angry, not hostile, just measured. Morrison sat, his hands shaking slightly as he placed them on his knees. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to somehow undo the last 3 hours of his life, but Williams' warning kept him silent. Captain Chen studied him for a long moment. "Do you know why you're here?" "Yes, ma'am. In the mess hall, I pushed past you. I was disrespectful. I didn't know you were an officer, ma'am, but that's not an excuse. I should have shown courtesy to everyone, regardless of rank." It was a rehearsed answer. Staff Sergeant Chen had coached him during those agonizing 45 minutes, but Morrison meant every word. The shame was genuine, overwhelming. "You're right," Chen said. "It's not an excuse, but I want you to understand something, Lance Corporal. I didn't call this meeting to end your career." Morrison's head snapped up, hope and confusion across his face. Chen leaned forward slightly. "I've been on this base for 9 days. In that time, I've observed dozens of training exercises, reviewed hundreds of pages of documents, and watched how Marines at every level interact with each other. What happened in that mess hall wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something much larger." She opened her notepad, revealing pages of handwritten notes. "Your battalion is preparing for deployment to a combat zone. When you get there, discipline won't be optional. Military bearing won't be something you can turn on and off. The habits you build here will determine whether you and your fellow Marines come home alive." Lieutenant Colonel Reeves shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading, but Chen continued. "You disrespected me because you've been conditioned, whether intentionally or not, to see people as obstacles rather than fellow Marines. You were rushed, stressed, and focused solely on your immediate needs. Those are exactly the conditions under which combat happens. Lance Corporal, when you're exhausted, when you're scared, when everything is chaotic, that's when your training and discipline matter most." Morrison nodded slowly, beginning to understand that this wasn't just about punishment. Chen pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "This is your service record. Decent rifle scores, adequate PFT, no major disciplinary issues. You're not a bad Marine, Morrison, but you're not becoming the Marine you could be. And that's partly your fault, and partly the fault of a system that's been pushing you through training pipelines without ensuring you truly understand what it means to wear this uniform." She paused, letting that sink in. "So, here's what's going to happen. You're not getting court-martialed. You're not getting NJP. Instead, you're going to become part of something different." Morrison's head snapped up, hope and confusion warring across his face. Chen leaned forward slightly. "I've been on this base for 9 days. In that time, I've observed dozens of training exercises, reviewed hundreds of pages of documents, and watched how Marines at every level interact with each other. Your battalion is preparing for deployment to a combat zone. When you get there, discipline won't be optional. Military bearing won't be something you can turn on and off. The habits you build here will determine whether you and your fellow Marines come home alive." Lieutenant Colonel Reeves shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading, but Chen continued. "You disrespected me because you've been conditioned, whether intentionally or not, to see people as obstacles rather than fellow Marines. You were rushed, stressed, and focused solely on your immediate needs. Those are exactly the conditions under which combat happens.
Lance Corporal, when you're exhausted, when you're scared, when everything is chaotic, that's when your training and discipline matter most. Morrison nodded slowly, beginning to understand that this wasn't just about punishment. Chen pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. This is your service record. Decent rifle scores, adequate PFT, no major disciplinary issues. You're not a bad Marine, Morrison, but you're not becoming the Marine you could be. And that's partly your fault, and partly the fault of a system that's been pushing you through training pipelines without ensuring you truly understand what it means to wear this uniform. She paused, letting that sink in. So, here's what's going to happen. You're not getting court-martialed. You're not getting NJP. Instead, you're going to become part of something different.
Morrison, and more than that, you're going to help me teach it. Captain Rodriguez spoke for the first time. Ma'am, with respect, Morrison is one of our junior Marines. How can he? He can teach by example, Chen interrupted, by showing the transformation from where he is now to where he needs to be, by being honest about his failures and his growth. She turned back to Morrison. This won't be easy. In fact, it will probably be harder than any punishment I could give you. You're going to have to stand in front of your peers and admit what you did wrong. You're going to have to do extra training on top of your regular schedule, and you're going to have to hold yourself to a higher standard than you've ever maintained before. Morrison's mind reeled. This was so far outside what he'd expected that he struggled to process it. But here's what you'll get in return, Chen continued. You'll get the mentorship and training you should have received from day one. Sergeant Major Williams has agreed to personally oversee your development. You'll learn what it really means to be a Marine, not just in combat skills, but in character and leadership. Williams spoke from his position by the door. You belong to me now, Morrison. For the next 8 weeks, I'm going to be your shadow. Every mistake, every shortcut, every moment of laziness, I'm going to catch it and correct it. By the time I'm done with you, you'll either be one of the best lance corporals in this battalion, or you'll have proven you don't deserve to wear that uniform. The words should have been terrifying, but somehow they weren't. They were clarifying. Morrison was being given something he hadn't even known he was missing, a chance to actually become excellent, rather than just adequate. I understand you need time to think about this, Chen said, but I need an answer now. Are you willing to do the work? Morrison didn't hesitate. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am. Good. Chen made a note in her book. You'll report to Sergeant Major Williams tomorrow at 5 o'clock. Bring your best uniform and be prepared to learn. This program will also involve weekly sessions where I'll meet with you and discuss not just what you're learning, but why it matters. I'm going to share stories from my deployments, Morrison. Real stories about what happens when discipline breaks down in combat and what happens when Marines have it locked on. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves finally spoke, his voice carrying authority. Lance Corporal Morrison, Captain Chen is offering you an opportunity most Marines never get. Don't waste it. And understand this, the entire battalion will be watching. If you fail, if you give anything less than 100%, there will be consequences. Am I clear? Crystal clear, sir. Chen stood, and everyone else immediately came to attention. We're done here. Morrison, you're dismissed. Report back to your platoon and inform your chain of command that you'll be on a modified training schedule starting tomorrow. Staff Sergeant Chen will receive the details within the hour. Morrison stood, rendered the sharpest salute of his life, and executed an about-face. As he walked toward the door with Sergeant Major Williams, he heard Captain Chen's voice one more time. Morrison. He stopped and turned. Ma'am? I'm giving you this chance because I believe in second chances when they're earned, but I'm also giving you this chance because your battalion needs it. Every Marine in this command is going to learn from what happens next. Make sure the lesson is worth teaching. I will, ma'am. I swear it. As Morrison left the building and stepped back into the bright California afternoon, he felt different. The fear was still there, but it was mixed now with something else: purpose, determination, and the first real sense of what it might mean to be truly excellent at something that mattered. Behind him, in that conference room, Captain Sarah Chen was already planning the next phase of her campaign to transform not just one young Marine, but an entire battalion's culture. The unexpected move had been made. Now came the hard part, following through. The alarm on Derek Morrison's phone screamed at 4:30 hours, shattering what little sleep he'd managed. He'd lain awake most of the night, his mind cycling through fear, anticipation, and a strange sense of relief. Today marked the beginning of something he couldn't fully comprehend yet, a complete reconstruction of everything he thought he knew about being a Marine. He dressed in the dark, careful not to wake his roommate, and put on his service uniform with a level of precision he'd never bothered with before. Every button aligned, every crease sharp, boots polished until they reflected the dim barracks lights. If Sergeant Major Williams was going to pick apart everything about him, Morrison wasn't going to make it easy. At 4:55 hours, he stood outside the battalion headquarters 5 minutes early, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sergeant Major Williams emerged from the darkness at exactly 5 o'clock, appearing like a specter in the pre-dawn gloom. He walked a slow circle around Morrison, inspecting every detail with eyes that missed nothing. "Not bad," Williams finally said. "Your gig line is off by a 1/4 inch, your brass needs more polish, and your haircut is 3 days overdue, but it's a start." He stepped back. "Do you know why we're starting at 5 o'clock, Morrison?" "To make the training harder, Sergeant Major." "Wrong." Williams began walking, and Morrison fell into step beside him. "We're starting at 5 o'clock because this is when leaders work. While everyone else sleeps, leaders are preparing, planning, and setting conditions for success. For the next 8 weeks, you're going to live like a leader, even though you're not one yet. Maybe you never will be, but we're going to find out." To find out, they walked to the physical training field where Williams had set up a small workspace, a folding table, 2 chairs, and a whiteboard mounted on an easel. The setup looked absurdly formal for a PT field in the dark. "Sit," Williams commanded. Morrison sat confused. He'd expected immediate physical punishment, endless push-ups, brutal conditioning runs, the kind of smoking that left Marines broken and gasping. Instead, Williams pulled out a 3-ring binder and opened it on the table. "This is your development plan," Williams explained. "Captain Chen and I built it yesterday evening. It covers 8 weeks broken into 4 phases. Physical fitness is only 20% of this program, Morrison. The other 80% is mental transformation, learning to think like a Marine who gives a damn about something bigger than himself." He flipped to the first page, revealing a detailed schedule that made Morrison's eyes widen. 0500, 060, Leadership Principles Study. 0600, 0700, Physical Training with emphasis on discipline and bearing. 0730, 0800, Uniform and Appearance Standards, Practical Application. The schedule continued through the entire day, ending at 2100 hours with personal reflection and journal writing. "This is on top of your regular training schedule," Williams clarified, watching Morrison's face carefully. "You'll still attend all your normal classes, all your platoon training, all your regular duties. This program happens in the margins, before everyone else wakes up, during lunch breaks, after everyone else goes to sleep. It's gonna suck, Morrison. Some days you're gonna want to quit, but quitting isn't an option because 300 Marines are watching to see if standards still matter in this battalion." Morrison swallowed hard. "I understand, Sergeant Major." "Do you? Let me tell you what you don't understand yet." Williams leaned forward, his voice dropping to something more personal than Morrison had ever heard from a senior enlisted Marine. "I've been doing this for 23 years. I've seen good Marines die because someone cut a corner, because someone thought the small stuff didn't matter, because leadership failed to instill discipline when it was easy and then couldn't enforce it when lives depended on it." He tapped the binder with one finger. "Captain Chen survived an ambush in Afghanistan that killed 3 Marines in her vehicle. You know why she lived? Because every Marine in that convoy had been trained to standards. Because they drilled so many times that when chaos erupted, muscle memory took over. Discipline under pressure, Morrison. That's what we're building here." The story hit Morrison like cold water. He'd known Captain Chen was a combat veteran, but hearing the reality, 3 dead Marines, a fight for survival, made everything suddenly painfully real. "I don't want to just avoid punishment, Sergeant Major," Morrison heard himself say. "I want to actually be good at this. I want to be someone my fellow Marines can count on." Williams studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Good. Then let's begin." The first week was methodical torture. Williams drilled Morrison on the 14 leadership traits, making him recite them perfectly while doing push-ups, during meals, in the middle of the night when Williams would call his cell phone and demand immediate answers. Justice, judgment, dependability, integrity, decisiveness, tact, initiative, endurance, bearing, unselfishness, courage, knowledge, loyalty, enthusiasm. But it wasn't just memorization. Williams made Morrison explain how each trait applied to real situations, including the mess hall incident. "Bearing," Williams would snap during their 0600 PT session. "How did you fail bearing in that mess hall?" "I let my personal frustration override my military discipline," Sergeant Major would gasp between push-ups. "I treated a fellow Marine with disrespect because I wasn't maintaining proper bearing under stress." And what does that tell you about combat? That if I can't maintain bearing in a mess hall, I'll fail when it actually matters, Sergeant Major. By week 2, other Marines began to notice the change. Morrison moved through the battalion area, spine straighter, movements more deliberate, eyes forward instead of downcast. When he passed officers or staff NCOs, his salutes were crisp and precise, executed at exactly 6 paces, held until properly returned. Captain Rodriguez pulled him aside one morning after a company formation. "Morrison, I'm hearing good things from Sergeant Major Williams. Keep it up." But the real test came during week 3, when Captain Chen summoned Morrison to her office for their first formal counseling session. Her temporary office was sparse but organized, with maps of Afghanistan on one wall and a bookshelf filled with leadership manuals and military history. She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "How are you handling the program?" she asked, her tone conversational, but her eyes analytical. "It's challenging, ma'am, but I'm learning more in 3 weeks than I learned in my first year as a Marine." "Tell me what you've learned specifically." Morrison had prepared for this, journaling every night as the program required. "I've learned that I was going through the motions, ma'am. I could recite the leadership traits, but I didn't live them. I could pass inspections, but I didn't understand why standards mattered. I was focused on just surviving each day rather than actually excelling at my job." Chen made a note. "And the mess hall incident, how do you see it now?" Morrison took a breath. This was harder. "I see it as a symptom of who I was becoming, ma'am. I was prioritizing my own convenience over respect for others. I was stressed and tired, so I took the easy path. Push through, don't think about anyone else, just get what I need and move on. That's not who a Marine should be." "No," Chen agreed quietly. "It's not, but it's who a lot of Marines become when the system fails them. When we're so focused on checking boxes and meeting training timelines that we forget to actually develop people." She pulled out a folder and showed Morrison a document he didn't recognize. Pages of typed observations, metrics, and analysis. "This is my evaluation report on this battalion. It's not complete yet, but I want you to see something." She pointed to a section titled Cultural Indicators, Deficiencies. Morrison's stomach dropped as he read entries documenting dozens of small failures: inconsistent uniform standards, inadequate NCO mentorship, shortcuts in training protocols, declining emphasis on core values education. "Your incident is mentioned here," Chen said, "but not the way you might think. I'm not using it as evidence that you're a failure. I'm using it as evidence that we, the Marine Corps, your chain of command, the system, failed to prepare you properly. That's on us, Morrison. We put you in a situation where you didn't have the tools to succeed, then acted surprised when you fell short." Morrison felt something unexpected. Validation. Not for what he'd done, but for the confusion and frustration he'd felt before this program started. "But here's the important part," Chen continued, flipping to another section. "I'm also documenting the corrective actions. This program you're in, the changes Sergeant Major Williams is implementing, the battalion-wide training we're about to roll out, All of it goes in this report as proof that when leadership recognizes problems, they can be fixed. She closed the folder and looked directly at Morrison. You're not just fixing yourself, you're proving that the fix is possible. That's a heavy responsibility. I understand, ma'am. I don't think you do. Not fully. Not yet. Chen stood and walked to the window overlooking the parade deck. In 4 weeks, you're going to stand in front of a company formation and tell 200 Marines what you did wrong and what you learned. You're going to be vulnerable, Morrison. You're going to expose your failures so others can learn from them. Can you handle that? The thought terrified him, but Morrison heard himself say, "Yes, ma'am. If it helps other Marines avoid my mistakes, I can handle it." Chen turned back to face him, and for the first time, Morrison saw something in her expression that looked like approval. Good. Then we'll continue. Dismissed. As Morrison left her office and returned to his duties, he felt the weight of transformation settling onto his shoulders. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about proving that Marines could change, that standards could be restored, that excellence was still possible even when the system had allowed it to slip. Sergeant Major Williams was waiting outside, a knowing look on his weathered face. "She gave you the speech about responsibility." "Yes, Sergeant Major." "And you still want to continue?" Morrison didn't hesitate. "Absolutely, Sergeant Major." Williams allowed himself the smallest smile. "Outstanding. Now drop and give me 50 for being 2 minutes late getting back to the company area." "Bearing, Morrison. Even when you're thinking deep thoughts, you maintain awareness of time and place." As Morrison counted out push-ups on the sidewalk, other Marines passing by stared. Some looked confused, others looked curious. A few looked envious of the attention and personal development Morrison was receiving. The transformation was happening, not just in Morrison, but rippling outward through the entire battalion. The real test was still coming. 3 months after the mess hall incident, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines was unrecognizable to anyone who'd known it before. The change didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen easily. It came through 1,000 small corrections, uncomfortable conversations, and the persistent pressure of leadership that refused to accept mediocrity. Sergeant Major Williams stood at the back of the battalion classroom, arms crossed, watching Sergeant Major Williams deliver a presentation on military courtesy and customs to a room packed with 60 junior Marines. This was the 5th iteration of the class this week. They were cycling every Marine in the battalion through the training, no exceptions. "Let me be crystal clear about something," Williams said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "This isn't about kissing officers' boots. This isn't about meaningless traditions that make officers feel important. This is about the framework that holds us together when everything else falls apart." He clicked to the next slide, showing a photograph from Afghanistan. Marines in full combat gear conducting a patrol in hostile territory. Every single one of these Marines knows their job. They're technically proficient, physically fit, and tactically sound. But you know what keeps them alive? The fact that they trust each other completely. And that trust is built on the foundation of mutual respect, discipline, and standards that apply to everyone all the time. A lance corporal in the second row raised his hand. "Sergeant Major, but how does saluting officers help us in combat?" It was exactly the question Williams wanted. Because the habit of showing respect, of maintaining discipline even when you're tired or stressed or frustrated, that habit becomes automatic. When rounds are coming down range and everything is chaos, you don't rise to the occasion. You fall back on your training and your habits. He paused, letting that sink in. If your habit is to take shortcuts, to disrespect people, to only follow standards when someone's watching, what do you think happens when the stakes are life and death? The room was silent. These weren't abstract concepts anymore. Chen insisted that every training session include real stories, real consequences, real examples of what happened when discipline either held or failed. Williams clicked to another slide. This one showed Corporal Derek Morrison in dress blues, standing at parade rest, looking every inch the professional Marine he'd become. 3 months ago, this Marine was facing the end of his career.
He'd let standards slip. He'd stopped seeing people as fellow Marines and started seeing them as obstacles. And when he physically shoved Captain Chen in the mess hall, he thought he was just having a bad day. He didn't realize he was revealing the kind of Marine he'd become. Morrison himself sat in the front row, his spine rigid. Chen had asked him if he could handle being used as a teaching example in every class, and he'd agreed without hesitation. It was still uncomfortable hearing his failure discussed openly, but he understood why it mattered. Corporal Morrison volunteered to participate in a new leadership development program. Williams continued, and I'm going to let him tell you what he learned. Corporal, front and center. Morrison stood and moved to the front of the classroom with the bearing and confidence that have become second nature over the past 12 weeks. He faced his peers, Marines he'd served alongside, some who'd witnessed his transformation, others who only knew the rumors. 12 weeks ago, I didn't think I had a problem, Morrison began, his voice steady. I was passing my PFTs, qualifying with my rifle, showing up to my assignments. I thought that was enough. But I was wrong. He gestured to the photograph of Captain Chen's office that Williams had included in the presentation, the one showing her medals and commendations. When I shoved Captain Chen, I wasn't thinking about her as a person, as a fellow Marine, or as a decorated combat veteran. I was only thinking about myself, my schedule, my convenience, my frustration. That's not what a Marine does. That's what a selfish individual does. A corporal in the third row spoke up. But we're all under pressure. We've all got tight schedules and competing demands. How are we supposed to maintain perfect military bearing all the time? Morrison nodded, acknowledging the question. That's exactly what I asked Sergeant Major Williams during week 2 of my training. You know what he told me? He said that maintaining bearing under pressure isn't about being perfect. It's about making a conscious choice every single time to uphold standards even when it's inconvenient. He walked to the whiteboard and picked up a marker. Let me show you what my average day looks like now. He began writing. 500, 600, leadership study. 600, 700, physical training. 7:30, 16:30, regular duties and training. 16:30, 17:30, additional professional development. 17:30, 1800, uniform preparation for next day. 1800, 1900, dinner and personal time. 1900, 2100, study, mentorship sessions, or community service. 2100, 2130, journal reflection and planning for next day. That's a 15-hour day minimum, Morrison said, turning back to face the class. I'm busier now than I've ever been, but you know what? I haven't had a single moment where I felt like cutting corners or disrespecting someone because I've built different habits. When you train yourself to maintain standards, even when it's hard, it actually becomes easier than constantly deciding which corners to cut. The class absorbed this in silence. Chen made notes on her tablet, documenting the engagement and response. This was the cultural shift she'd been engineering, using Morrison's transformation as proof that change was possible, that excellence was achievable, that the old excuses no longer held water. After the class ended, Chen joined Williams in his office. 5 down, 12 more iterations to go. How are the Marines responding? Williams pulled up a spreadsheet on his computer. Disciplinary incidents are down 42% since we started the training. Uniform and appearance violations down 67%. More significantly, we're seeing junior Marines correct each other now instead of just ignoring substandard behavior. He clicked to another tab, showing survey results. The command climate surveys we administered last week show an 18-point increase in Marines reporting they feel proud to serve in this battalion. That's substantial movement in just 3 months. Chen studied the numbers, pleased but not satisfied. What about the NCOs? Are they maintaining the pressure? Most of them, yes, but we've got about 15% who are still treating this as a temporary crackdown rather than a permanent culture change. Staff Sergeant Ramirez told one of his junior Marines that this will all blow over once Captain Chen leaves. Chen's eyes narrowed.
Set up a meeting with Ramirez. If our staff NCOs aren't bought in, this won't sustain after I'm gone." That afternoon, Chen met with Lieutenant Colonel Reeves to discuss the battalion's progress. The commander's initial resistance to her evaluation had transformed into genuine partnership as he'd seen the results. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," Reeves said, using her first name for the first time since they'd met. "And now?" Chen asked. "Now I see that you were exactly what this battalion needed. We'd let standards erode so gradually that we didn't even notice it happening. We were like the frog in slowly boiling water." He gestured to a chart on his wall, showing various indicators. "Every indicator is moving in the right direction. More importantly, I can feel the difference when I walk through the battalion area. Marines carry themselves differently. They take pride in their appearance, their work, their relationships with each other." Chen nodded, accepting the acknowledgement, but already thinking about sustainability. "Sir, the real test comes after I leave. The changes we've implemented need to become permanent parts of how this battalion operates, not just a special program."
Program associated with my evaluation. "I'm working on that," Reeves assured her. "I've embedded the new training programs into our standing operating procedures. Sergeant Major Williams has trained 12 NCOs to continue Morrison's development program with other junior Marines who need intensive mentorship, and I've made it clear to my officers that maintaining these standards is now part of their fitness report evaluation." Chen appreciated the systematic approach, but she knew organizational change required more than just policies. "What about storytelling? Are your leaders sharing the why behind these standards or just enforcing them?" Reeves thought for a moment. "That's a gap. Most of my NCOs are good at correcting deficiencies, but they're not as skilled at explaining the deeper purpose." "Then that's our next phase," Chen said, already formulating a plan. "We need to train your leaders to be teachers, not just enforcers. Morrison understands this now. He can explain not just what standards exist, but why they matter. We need every NCO in this battalion to be able to do the same." Over the following weeks, Chen implemented a leader-as-teacher program, requiring every NCO to prepare and deliver a 15-minute class on one aspect of Marine Corps values, customs, or standards. The catch was that they had to include personal stories, times when they'd either upheld or failed to maintain standards and what they'd learned. The first few sessions were awkward. Staff sergeants and gunnery sergeants who were comfortable barking orders struggled with vulnerability in storytelling, but Chan and Williams worked with them individually, coaching them on how to connect abstract principles to concrete experiences. Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell, Morrison's company gunny, delivered one of the most powerful sessions. He told the story of losing a Marine in Iraq because intelligence hadn't been properly communicated up the chain of command. "I was a sergeant then," Mitchell said, his voice heavy with old pain. "I noticed something off about a building we were supposed to clear, but I didn't report it through proper channels because I didn't think it was significant enough. I took a shortcut on procedure. That building was rigged with explosives. Lance Corporal Martinez died because I didn't follow proper reporting protocols." The room was silent as Mitchell continued. "So when I see you cutting corners on communications procedures, on proper radio etiquette, on following the chain of command, I don't see minor infractions. I see Lance Corporal Martinez's mother receiving a folded flag. That's why standards matter. That's why we don't get to decide which rules are important and which ones aren't." After that session, Chen noticed a shift in how Marines responded to corrections. They weren't just complying to avoid punishment, they were beginning to internalize the deeper purpose behind military discipline. Morrison, now fully transformed and serving as a peer mentor to 3 other junior Marines, approached Chen one evening after a training session. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for not giving up on me. I know it would have been easier to just punish me and move on." Chen looked at the young corporal who bore little resemblance to the frustrated, directionless Lance Corporal from 3 months earlier. "Morrison, I never gave up on you because I never believed you were the problem. You were a symptom. This battalion's culture was the problem. You just helped me fix it." "I hope I can keep helping, ma'am." "You will," Chen assured him. "Long after I'm gone, you'll be here, showing other Marines what's possible when someone commits to excellence."
As Morrison walked away, Chen reflected on how far the battalion had come. The cultural shift was real, measurable, and, if maintained, would save lives. When these Marines deployed to combat, the transformation was complete. Now came the final test, proving it could last. 6 months after the Mesh Hall incident, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines touched down at a forward operating base in a contested region of the Middle East. The deployment came faster than expected. A crisis had erupted, and the battalion was tapped as the Quick Reaction Force due to their recent certification scores and improved readiness metrics. Corporal Derek Morrison stepped off the C-130 transport aircraft into the scorching heat of the desert, his rifle held at low ready, scanning the perimeter with eyes trained by months of intensive preparation. His fire team, 3 Marines he'd been training and mentoring for the past 4 months, moved in perfect formation behind him. Lance Corporal Sarah Kim, Private First Class Andre Williams, and Private First Class Jose Rodriguez had all volunteered to serve under Morrison specifically because they'd witnessed his transformation and wanted that same level of development for themselves. "Spread out, maintain your intervals," Morrison ordered quietly, his voice calm and controlled. 6 months ago, he would have barked the command with frustration. Now, it was professional, measured, exactly what his Marines needed to hear. They responded instantly, adjusting their spacing without hesitation. The battalion's first 2 weeks in country were relatively quiet: patrol rotations, security operations, and intelligence gathering. But Morrison noticed something significant. The cultural changes Captain Chen had implemented back at Pendleton were holding under the stress of deployment. Marines maintained discipline during boring guard shifts. NCOs mentored their junior Marines even when exhausted. Standards remained high, even when it would have been easier to let them slip.
The real test came during the 3rd week. Morrison's squad was conducting a routine patrol through a small village when his fire team encountered a group of civilians fleeing from the northern section of the settlement. Women carrying children, old men moving as fast as their aged bodies would allow, all of them terrified and speaking frantically in Arabic. 6 months ago, hell, even 3 months ago, Morrison would have seen them as a problem, an obstacle complicating his mission. His first instinct would have been to move them aside quickly and continue with his assigned route, but that wasn't who he was anymore. "Hold position," Morrison commanded his team, using hand signals to establish a security perimeter. He keyed his radio. "Alpha 1-2, this is Alpha 1-2 Bravo. We have approximately 20 civilians fleeing from grid November Whiskey 478295, requesting TUP support and guidance. Over." While waiting for a response, Morrison approached the civilians carefully, weapon lowered but ready, his body language non-threatening. He'd learned from Captain Chen's stories that how you treated people, even in the chaos of deployment, defined what kind of Marine you were. The battalion interpreter arrived within minutes, and Morrison learned that the civilians were fleeing from a group of armed insurgents who'd taken over several buildings in the northern village section. The insurgents were reportedly holding more civilians as human shields. "How many armed fighters?" Morrison asked through the interpreter, pulling out his notepad. Another habit from his training with Sergeant Major Williams: document everything. Details matter. An elderly man held up both hands, then 3 more fingers. 13 fighters, possibly more. Morrison processed the information rapidly, his mind working through the implications. This wasn't just intelligence, this was an immediate threat requiring response. He radioed the information up to a squad leader, Staff Sergeant Chen, who had become one of Morrison's most important mentors during the cultural transformation. The lesson had stuck. They maintained the observation post for 3 hours, feeding steady intelligence reports back to the Battalion Operations Center. Morrison documented 17 separate observations about enemy positions, civilian locations, and tactical considerations. His reports were clear, concise, and actionable, exactly what commanders needed to make informed decisions. When the Quick Reaction Force finally moved in to neutralize the insurgent threat, they did so with precision, based largely on Morrison's intelligence. The operation lasted 47 minutes. All hostages were rescued, 11 insurgents were captured, 2 were killed while attempting to detonate explosives, 0 civilian casualties, 0 friendly casualties. That night, back at the forward operating base, Lieutenant Colonel Reeves called Morrison to the operations center. The battalion commander looked tired but satisfied.
Corporal Morrison, your fire team's actions today potentially saved dozens of lives, both civilian and military. Your decision to stop and gather intelligence instead of just pushing through on your patrol route gave us the information we needed to execute that operation successfully. Morrison stood at attention, unsure how to respond. Sir, I was just doing my job, applying the training. Reeves smiled slightly. That's exactly my point. 6 months ago, would you have made the same decision? Morrison thought about the Marine he'd been in that mess hall.
Rushed, frustrated, seeing people as obstacles. No, sir. Honestly, I probably would have moved those civilians aside and continued my patrol without really listening to them. I would have seen them as slowing me down rather than as sources of critical intelligence. And what changed? Captain Chen taught me to see people, sir, not just as obstacles or mission complications, but as human beings who deserve respect and attention. Sergeant Major Williams taught me that discipline and bearing under pressure isn't about being rigid. It's about maintaining your values and standards even when it's hard. When I saw those scared civilians today, I didn't see a problem. I saw people who needed help and information we needed to collect. The training just kicked in. Reeves nodded slowly. I'm putting you in for a Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal for your actions today. But more importantly, I'm writing to Major Chen. She got promoted last month, to let her know that the culture she helped us build just proved itself in combat. After he was dismissed, Morrison walked through the forward operating base toward his living quarters. He passed other Marines from the battalion, some conducting maintenance on vehicles, others preparing for the next day's patrols. A few gathered around a satellite phone, waiting to call home. Every single one of them looked different than they had 6 months ago. Sharper, more professional, more purposeful. The transformation that had started with one embarrassing incident in a mess hall had rippled outward through an entire battalion, and now it was saving lives in combat. Morrison pulled out his personal journal, a habit he'd maintained from the development program, and began writing about the day's events. He documented not just what happened, but what he'd learned, how he'd felt, what he could improve for next time. Dear Major Chen, he wrote at the bottom of the entry, today your training saved lives. The habits you and Sergeant Major Williams built into me became automatic when it mattered most. I finally understand what you meant when you said discipline under pressure determines who lives and who dies. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for showing me what it means to be a real Marine. He closed the journal and looked up at the stars visible in the desert sky, so much brighter here than they'd ever been at Camp Pendleton. Somewhere back in the United States, Major Sarah Chen was probably working on her next assignment, transforming another unit, fixing another broken culture. Morrison hoped that she knew that her work had mattered, that the lessons had stuck, that the Marine who'd shoved past her in frustrated disrespect had become someone who treated every person, civilian or Marine, junior or senior, with the dignity they deserved. The deployment would continue for 7 more months. There would be more patrols, more danger, more tests of everything they'd learned. But Morrison was ready. His battalion was ready. The transformation was complete, and combat had proven it real. Major Sarah Chen sat in her office at Marine Corps headquarters in Quantico, Virginia, reviewing after-action reports from units deployed across 3 different theaters. Her new assignment as a strategic planning officer kept her far from the front lines, but she remained connected to the Marines who fought there through the endless stream of intelligence reports, operational summaries, and command evaluations that crossed her desk. It was a cold January morning, almost exactly a year since she'd walked into that mess hall at Camp Pendleton and been shoved by a young lance corporal who had no idea who she was. The incident seemed like ancient history now, yet its ripples continued to spread in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. Her computer pinged with a new email. The subject line read, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines Deployment Summary for your review. Sarah opened it immediately. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines had just completed their 7-month deployment and returned to the United States. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves had sent her the final assessment report along with a personal note. Major Chen, the note began, I wanted you to be among the first to see these numbers. What you built with us didn't just survive deployment, it thrived. This battalion accomplished its mission with the level of professionalism and effectiveness that exceeded every metric. More importantly, we're bringing everyone home, not a single KIA, lowest casualty rate of any infantry battalion in the region. I'm convinced your cultural transformation is the reason why.
Sarah scrolled through the attached statistics, her trained analytical mind processing the data. Disciplinary incidents during deployment, down 73% compared to the battalion's previous deployment. Combat effectiveness ratings highest in the Marine Expeditionary Unit. Re-enlistment commitments up 41%. Junior Marines requesting promotion to NCO up 62%. But it was the qualitative data that truly captured her attention. The report included dozens of individual citations and awards, many of them going to Marines who had participated in the Cultural Transformation Program. Corporal Derek Morrison's name appeared repeatedly, a Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal for intelligence gathering that prevented civilian casualties, multiple commendations for leadership under fire, and a meritorious promotion recommendation to sergeant. There was more. Morrison had been selected to attend the Corporal's Course, a leadership development program for junior NCOs. His commanding officers had nominated him for the Battalion Leadership Award. Most significantly, he'd been chosen to help develop a new
Marine Corps training program on cultural discipline and professional military bearing. Sarah leaned back in her chair, a slight smile crossing her face. The kid who'd shoved past her in frustrated disrespect had become exactly what she'd hoped. A leader who understood that excellence wasn't about physical prowess or technical skills alone, but about character, discipline, and treating every person with dignity. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed Sergeant Major Williams, who'd retired 2 weeks earlier after completing 24 years of service. "Major Chen?" Williams' familiar, growly voice came through the speaker. "I hope I'm not interrupting important Pentagon business." "Sergeant Major, you know you can call me anytime. How's retirement treating you?" "Like a punishment, ma'am, but that's not why I'm calling. I'm at Camp Pendleton right now for a ceremony, and I thought you'd want to know what's happening." Sarah heard background noise, the sound of Marines in formation, commands being shouted, the unmistakable atmosphere of a military ceremony. "They're dedicating the new Leadership Development Center," Williams explained. "The Commandant approved permanent facilities for the mentorship program we built. 3 classrooms, a library of leadership resources, spaces for one-on-one counseling sessions. It's going to serve the entire base, not just 35. Sarah felt genuine surprise. She'd hoped the program would continue, but she hadn't imagined it would expand to this scale. "And there's something else," Williams continued. "They're calling it the Chen Leadership Development Center. Your name, ma'am. The Commandant specifically directed it in recognition of your work transforming battalion culture." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the weight of that honor. Her name would be on a building where thousands of Marines would be trained, mentored, and developed over the coming years. It was humbling and slightly overwhelming. "I don't know what to say, Sergeant Major." "You don't need to say anything. You did the work. You saw a problem everyone else had accepted as normal, and you fixed it. Marines are alive today because you refused to tolerate mediocrity." The ceremony continued in the background, and Williams held the phone up so Sarah could hear. A voice she recognized, Lieutenant Colonel Reeves, now promoted to full colonel, was speaking to the assembled formation. "The Marine standing behind me is Sergeant Derek Morrison," Reeves announced. "1 year ago, Sergeant Morrison made a mistake that could have ended his career. Instead, it became the catalyst for transforming this battalion's culture. Today, he stands as proof that Marines can change, that excellence is achievable, and that leadership committed to development can create extraordinary results." Sarah heard applause, then Morrison's voice as he addressed the formation. "I was lost," Morrison said, his voice carrying across the parade deck. "I was going through the motions, doing the minimum and convincing myself that was enough. Major Chen could have destroyed me for my disrespect. Instead, she rebuilt me. More importantly, she rebuilt our entire battalion's understanding of what it means to be a Marine." His voice grew stronger. "The lessons I learned aren't complicated. Treat every person with dignity. Maintain your standards even when it's hard. Understand that discipline isn't restriction. It's the foundation that keeps us alive when everything goes wrong. These aren't just words. They're the difference between success and failure in combat." Morrison paused, and Sarah could picture him standing at attention, addressing hundreds of his fellow Marines. "This leadership center represents a promise," he continued, "a promise that the Marine Corps will never accept mediocrity, that we'll invest in our people, develop their potential,
and hold them to standards worthy of the title we bear. I'm honored to be part of this legacy, and I'm committed to paying forward the investment Major Chen and Sergeant Major Williams made in me." More applause. Williams came back on the line. "He's come a long way, ma'am." "You both did that," Sarah said. "I just identified the problem. You and Morrison did the hard work of actually fixing it. We were a team. Still are, even if I'm collecting retirement pay now." After the call ended, Sarah sat in silence, looking out her window at the Virginia winter landscape. Snow was beginning to fall, coating the trees and buildings in white. Somewhere in California, Marines were dedicating a building that bore her name. Somewhere in the world, young Marines were being developed by leaders who understood that discipline and dignity mattered more than checking boxes. Her assistant knocked on the doorframe. "Ma'am, the General is ready for your briefing on the new training initiative." Sarah gathered her materials, a comprehensive proposal for implementing cultural development programs across the entire Marine Corps based on the success of the Pendleton transformation. The Commandant himself would review it next week. As Sarah walked through the Pentagon corridors toward the briefing room, she thought about legacy. Not the building bearing her name, not the awards or recognition, but the actual impact on real Marines doing real missions in dangerous places. Morrison was alive and thriving because someone had invested in his development. His fire team had survived combat because Morrison had learned to see people rather than obstacles. Civilians had been rescued because a young corporal had maintained discipline under pressure and gathered intelligence instead of just pushing through his assigned route. That was legacy. That was what mattered. 3 weeks later, Sarah received a package at her office. Inside was a photograph from the dedication ceremony at Camp Pendleton.
It showed the new Leadership Center, a modern professional facility with glass windows and the Marine Corps emblem prominently displayed. Below the emblem, carved in stone, Chen Leadership Development Center, excellence through character. But it was the second photograph that truly moved her. It showed Sergeant Morrison standing with his fire team, Lance Corporal Kim, now a corporal herself, PFC Williams, now a Lance Corporal, and PFC Rodriguez, who'd been meritoriously promoted for actions during deployment. They were all in dress blues, ribbons on their chests, pride in their bearing. On the back of the photo, Morrison had written, "Major Chen, we are who you taught us to be. Semper Fidelis, SGT, Derek Morrison." Sarah placed the photograph on her desk next to pictures of her own deployments, her own mentors, her own journey through the Marine Corps. She thought about that mess hall, that rushed moment, that young Marine who'd shoved past her without looking. She'd seen something in him that day, not just failure, but potential, not just disrespect, but the symptom of a system that had stopped developing its people. And she'd made a choice to fix both the individual and the system. Now, a year later, the ripples continued to spread. The Chen Leadership Development Center would train thousands of Marines. The cultural transformation model was being studied for implementation Corps-wide. Morrison himself was becoming a mentor to the next generation. A knock on her door interrupted her reflection. Another officer poked his head in. "Major Chen, the Commandant approved your proposal. He wants to see you tomorrow morning to discuss implementation timeline. Looks like you're about to transform the entire Marine Corps the way you transformed 3-5. Sarah nodded, already thinking about the work ahead. It would be challenging. Some units would resist. Some leaders would push back. Change was always difficult. But she'd done it before. She knew it was possible. And somewhere in California, at a leadership center bearing her name, young Marines were learning that excellence wasn't optional. It was the standard. The mess hall incident that had started with frustration and disrespect had become something far greater. Proof that culture could change, that Marines could transform, and that leadership committed to development could create results that saved lives. Sarah Chen smiled and began preparing for tomorrow's meeting with the Commandant. The work was just beginning. The legacy would endure for generations. The end.